Cowboys weren't fearless heroes, they were sun-fried teenagers arguing with cows and losing. The Wild West wasn't wild, it was just poorly supervised. And if you think the myths are embarrassing now, wait until you see what people actually believed. 1. Cowboys allegedly lived in a non-stop blur of gunfights, as if the entire West was one long action scene waiting for a dramatic soundtrack. But the reality is that most frontier towns had fewer annual shootouts than a modern upper surface has printer jams because the average cowboy wasn't a gunslinging demigod, just an exhausted ranch employee with blisters, sunburn, and a gun. He mostly used to scare snakes and avoid awkward conversations. The myth of the gunslinger came from dime novels written by men whose closest encounter with danger was a paper cut. And yet, somehow, the whole world decided that fiction counts as anthropology, turning a workforce of overworked livestock managers into legendary duelists who supposedly solved every disagreement by firing in the air like malfunctioning fireworks, which is hilarious, considering most of them could barely afford ammunition. But sure, let's pretend they walked around like low-budget action heroes instead of chronically dehydrated guys chasing cows that had more attitude than accuracy. 2. Hollywood insists cowboys spent every sunset riding off dramatically into the horizon, as if the West was contractually obligated to provide perfect golden lighting in a wind machine. But daily life wasn't a cinematic montage. It was hours of plodding through dust thick enough to qualify as a food group, while horses contributed their own atmospheric enhancements that no director would film without hazmat pay. Yet the myth survived because people adore the fantasy of a majestic departure instead of the truth. Most cowboys ended their day by collapsing on whatever surface didn't stab them, smelling like a combination of sweat, campfire, and livestock perfume, hardly the sweeping romance audiences imagine. But the myth loves to pretend these men lived inside a permanent screensaver, gently drifting toward glory, when in reality the only thing they drifted toward was a bedroll and a silent wish that boots came with air conditioning. 3. The idea that cowboys were rugged, disciplined masters of survival gets repeated with the confidence of someone quoting a motivational poster. But frontier life was full of people who treated the wilderness like a mildly inconvenient hallway, marching straight into deserts, canyons, and storms with the planning ability of a lost tourist. And yet, folklore insists they were wilderness whisperers capable of reading the land like a novel, even though the real West was full of cowhands who couldn't navigate without landmarks that mooed. The myth persists because it's easier to romanticize competence than admit that half the population wandered around guessing which direction looked less deadly, and the other half pretended to know so no one would question their cowboy credentials. But legend insists they were geniuses of terrain, when the only map many of them trusted was follow the herd and hope nothing bites. 4. Cowboy hats are portrayed as symbols of authority and wisdom, as if putting on one instantly upgrades intelligence like a downloadable expansion pack. But historically, the hat was less a fashion statement and more a portable sun shield designed for people who didn't have the luxury of shade or dermatologists. Yet the myth paints it as some enchanted crown that turns any wearer into a philosopher warrior. In truth, hats were swapped, lost, crushed, traded, stolen, and repurposed with the same dignity people show to cardboard boxes, and cowboys wore them because the sun was an unrelenting bully, not because they wanted to look dramatic on horseback. But pop culture turned the accessory into a personality trait, implying profound grit instead of, "My scalp is losing moisture faster than this canteen." The legend survives because audiences love symbols, even if the symbol was originally just practical head equipment for not getting cooked alive. 5. The myth that cowboys were fearless outlaws who bent society to their will is charming, until you acknowledge that most of them were contract laborers following instructions from ranch owners who would, shockingly, like their cows back in one piece. Modern depictions imagine them swaggering through saloons demanding respect, when historical accounts show a demographic mostly concerned with not getting trampled, not losing pay, and not drinking water that tasted like it had opinions. The cowboy as rebel archetype survives because audiences adore rebellion, even if nothing says anti-establishment less than performing cow logistics on a strict schedule. Yet fiction insists they were lone wolves deciding the fate of entire towns between dramatic standoffs, as if paperwork, fencing, and counting cattle didn't exist. But the reality is that the cowboy myth is basically a corporate job rebranded as a revolution. 6. The popular image of cowboys as expert gunsmiths who maintained firearms with ritualistic devotion ignores the inconvenient truth that many of them treated their weapons like slightly more dangerous luggage, rarely cleaned them, rarely practiced, and frequently misfired with all the confidence of someone blaming the wind. Yet movies portray them tuning revolvers like musicians preparing for a concerto, even though real cowhands prioritized rope, food, and not losing fingers more than mastering trick shots, and their legendary gun skills were largely invented by writers who had never held a weapon heavier than a pen. The myth lasted because audiences enjoy the idea of flawless marksmen roaming the frontier, but the actual frontier featured plenty of people whose accuracy was less sharpshooter and more accidental warning shot, which is far less glamorous, but a lot more honest. 7. The belief that cowboys constantly rescued damsels in distress might be the funniest lie the era produced, considering the West was full of women who ran businesses, farms, saloons, and entire towns with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for collapsing onto train tracks. Yet stories insisted they were fragile plot devices awaiting rescue by a man who hadn't washed his shirt since the administration of 3 different presidents. The trope persisted because pulp fiction needed romance, not realism, so it manufactured scenarios in which heroic cowboys saved delicate strangers from improbable dangers, despite the fact that most frontier women could outshoot, outwork, and outnegotiate half the men in town. But the legend stuck because it flatters both egos and nostalgia, even if it misrepresents an entire population as helpless background characters in their own lives. 8. The notion that cowboys lived on a steady diet of steaks grilled over crackling campfires is adorable if you enjoy nutritional fantasies, because the real menu leaned heavily toward beans, stale bread, and coffee strong enough to qualify as an industrial solvent. The myth survives because dramatic meals look good on film, not because anyone was feasting like frontier royalty. And the glamorous depiction ignores the fact that cowhands ate for calories, not joy, and usually consumed whatever didn't fight back or produce sparks when chewed. Yet people cling to the idea of cowboy cuisine as ruggedly delicious frontier fare, conveniently ignoring that most of it tasted like necessity mixed with regret. But sure, let's keep pretending every night was a culinary masterpiece instead of survival dining with extra grit, literally. 9. The claim that cowboys were stoic heroes who never complained has been repeated so often it practically counts as propaganda. But the truth is that ranch life produced a constant soundtrack of groaning, swearing, and inventive vocabulary specifically designed to describe how unpleasant everything felt. Surviving prairie weather, stubborn animals, and endless monotony didn't create silent warriors. It created experts in the art of muttered dissatisfaction. Yet storytelling prefers the fantasy of emotionless statues enduring hardship with a flinty gaze, as if complaining somehow ruins the myth. But real frontier workers expressed discomfort freely and often, and the refusal to admit this says more about modern romanticism than historical reality, turning a perfectly normal human trait into a fictional flaw that legends pretend never existed. 10. The fantasy that cowboys communicated in cryptic, poetic one-liners, always punctuated by a meaningful squint, has convinced generations that frontier dialogue sounded like a minimalist screenplay, even though real conversations were closer to logistical meetings about cattle location, weather damage, and whether something smelled like it was going to explode. Fiction crafted the cowboy voice as an elegant verbal dance, but the West was full of practical speech, blunt statements, and fewer metaphors than a government pamphlet. Yet storytellers decided the truth was too mundane and rewrote the entire region as a think tank of dusty philosophers. This myth survives because people want their icons to sound profound, not accurate. So cowboys became the frontier's unofficial poets instead of overworked laborers discussing chores that never ended. 11. The illusion that cowboys spent every evening playing harmonica under the stars suggests the West was a continent-wide music video. But most nights were dedicated to sleeping, avoiding insects, or resolving the daily mystery of why everything hurt. And musical moments were rare luxuries, not recurring episodes. Storytellers embellish the idea because it makes the frontier feel soulful and cinematic, transforming weary workers into romantic drifters serenading the universe, even though the likely soundtrack was coughing, snoring, and distant bovine commentary. But romantic myths thrive on ambiance, not accuracy. So the harmonica became a symbol of spiritual cowboy depth, ignoring the simple truth that silence and exhaustion were far more common than impromptu concerts. 12. The belief that cowboys rode magnificent, obedient horses into glory does a remarkable job of hiding the reality that horses are sentient bundles of opinions, many of which involve disagreeing with everything the rider wants, and frontier riders spent more time negotiating, bribing, pleading, or bouncing off the ground than forming magical bonds with equine soulmates. The myth of effortless partnership was invented for drama, not truth, because no one wants to watch a cowboy argue for 10 minutes with an animal that thinks the concept of forward is optional. Yet the legend persists, painting horses as noble co-stars instead of chaotic co-workers who frequently reminded riders which one actually controlled the legs. 13. The story that cowboys single-handedly tamed the West oversells the individual hero narrative while underselling the massive influence of railroads, corporations, governments, and pure logistical brute force. But myth prefers the idea of one sun-kissed icon wrangling civilization into existence, ignoring that expansion was more bureaucracy than bravery, filled with paperwork, policy, and the thrilling excitement of government negotiations. The lone cowboy myth survives because it simplifies a messy historical process into a digestible fable, portraying the frontier as a sandbox waiting for a charismatic man with a hat, when the actual forces shaping the region were colder, larger, and far more mechanical. 14. The assumption that cowboys spent their lives in endless barroom brawls turns the West into a cartoon universe where furniture exists solely to be broken. But most saloons preferred business over chaos, and large-scale fights were bad for profit, reputation, and teeth. Real establishments encouraged drinking, gambling, and predictable spending, not dramatic brawling. But fiction amplified the rare scraps into a defining cultural trait because nothing sells nostalgia like choreographed destruction. The truth is that most bar conversations were ordinary, even boring, and the average cowboy had neither the energy nor the dental insurance for daily combat. Yet the myth insists every saloon was one spilled drink away from a demolition derby. 15. The notion that cowboys were fashion icons with perfectly coordinated outfits ignores that frontier clothing was a survival tool, not an aesthetic statement, and garments were chosen based on durability, weather, and whether they were the least uncomfortable option available. But popular culture retroactively curated their wardrobes into a cohesive look, transforming functional garments into a stylish uniform that suggests intentional design instead of necessity-driven improvisation. The myth thrives because it gives the West visual order and personality, but the authentic appearance was closer to a patchwork of sweat-resistant fabrics, repair stitches, and whatever didn't fall off last season, hardly the polished aesthetic modern media pretends they wore with pride. 16. The comforting fantasy that cowboys were constantly surrounded by majestic wilderness untouched by human nonsense overlooks the far more realistic detail that vast chunks of the West looked less like a natural paradise and more like the world's largest construction project waiting for someone to invent zoning laws. Yet legend insists the frontier was pristine, poetic, and filled with postcard-worthy panoramas, even though many landscapes were basically dust, rocks, and the kind of shrubs that appear only when God gives up on aesthetics. The myth endures because people love imagining cowboys as solitary guardians of untouched beauty, instead of workers plodding through terrains that felt specifically engineered to test patience. But the truth is that most of the West offered less inspiration and more irritation, which is probably why storytellers replaced reality with endless sunsets. Much easier to admire than the authentic view of dirt, dryness, and plants that looked like they resented being alive. 17. The enduring idea that cowboys always rode into town with dramatic flair, spooking horses, and commanding attention conveniently hides the fact that most arrivals were anticlimactic shuffles into settlements where nothing happened except the immediate realization that everything looked exactly as dusty and unimpressed as the last place. Yet fiction promotes the concept of a grand entrance, as if the frontier operated like a stage musical waiting for its lead to arrive with choreography and charisma, when the typical welcome committee was a bored dog, an inattentive shopkeeper, and maybe a chicken conducting suspicious business in the road. But the myth survives because a cinematic arrival feels cooler than the historical reality of quietly trotting in while hoping the town at least had water that didn't taste like disappointment. 18. The romantic belief that cowboys possessed mystical wisdom about the stars, navigating by constellations with sage-like insight, gives them more credit than modern GPS technicians, when in truth most celestial knowledge boiled down to identifying the big obvious ones and confidently pretending everything else made sense. Yet popular culture insists they were cosmic scholars gazing meaningfully at the heavens as if composing poetry, instead of workers primarily concerned with whether nighttime meant colder temperatures and more opportunities for things to bite. But legends adore the image of a cowboy contemplating the universe, even though the average frontier night involved practicality, not philosophy, less pondering existence, and more trying not to freeze while the sky judges silently. 19. The myth that cowboys had impeccable moral codes, almost medieval knights with dirtier boots, reflects nostalgic wishful thinking rather than historical accuracy, because real frontier ethics were more situational, flexible, and heavily influenced by whether someone had eaten recently. But dime novels rebranded these workers into paragons of righteousness, turning ordinary personalities into icons of honor, who allegedly solved every disagreement with integrity instead of irritation. This glossy interpretation survives because it makes the West feel cleaner than it was, wrapping messy human behavior in a shiny layer of myth that suggests cowboys lived by rules worthy of a sacred scroll, when in reality their code was often just common sense mixed with the collective hope that fewer things would go wrong today than yesterday. 20. The idea that cowboys viewed ranch owners with deep loyalty, respect, and admiration imagines the frontier as a wholesome workplace sitcom instead of the grueling job site it was, where pay was low, conditions were punishing, and allegiance was often based on who provided the least miserable environment. But pop culture prefers portraying cowhands as fiercely devoted lieutenants serving benevolent bosses, even though ranchers were employers first, emotionally inspiring figures roughly never, and the working relationship resembled practicality more than passion. Yet the myth persists because audiences enjoy hierarchical harmony. It's more cinematic to believe everyone respected authority than to acknowledge that most workers simply tolerated whoever signed the checks. 21. The assumption that cowboys rode fearlessly through thunderstorms, unfazed by lightning cracking around them like nature's temper tantrum, plays beautifully on screen but ignores the small scientific detail that metal gear, tall hats, and elevated riders combine into a traveling lightning invitation. Nonetheless, stories depict them as stoic silhouettes braving the storm without flinching, when the more realistic emotional response would resemble, "I would like not to die today." But that sold fewer books. Storytellers turned hazardous weather into visual poetry, editing out the rational caution that any human would display when the sky decides to throw electricity around like free samples. But the myth remains because fearless heroism looks inspiring, even if it defies both logic and meteorology. 22. The popular fantasy that cowboys had deep spiritual connections with the land imagines them as environmental philosophers gently communing with nature, when much of their daily relationship with the environment consisted of dodging hazards, cursing terrain, and attempting to coax unwilling animals across landscapes designed by a committee of misanthropic rocks. But fiction elevates their interactions into a sacred bond, suggesting the West whispered secrets exclusively to hat-wearing individuals on horseback, even though the only whispers most riders heard came from wind, insects, and an occasional rattlesnake offering negative feedback. Yet the legend thrives because meaningful connection sounds nobler than pragmatic endurance. 23. The belief that cowboys expertly lassoed anything that moved, steers, criminals, renegade hats, comes from the same creative optimism that believes anyone can simply pick up a violin and perform at concert level after 2 attempts. While roping was indeed a skill, it was one learned through painful trial and error, yet popular depictions twist it into a magical reflex, suggesting cowboys casually looped ropes around targets with the precision of a malfunctioning superhero. Storytelling inflated this into a signature ability because it looks impressive and distracts from the reality that most workable rope technique involved patience, practice, and avoiding tying oneself to something with stronger opinions. But the myth remains because it's more entertaining to imagine flawless talent than realistic practice. 24. The classic image of cowboys leaning dramatically against fences, contemplating life like unpaid philosophers, has become so ingrained that audiences forget fences were not emotional props, but functional barriers used to convince animals to remain in one place long enough for people to stop panicking. Yet fiction assigns profound meaning to these wooden structures, treating them like therapists quietly absorbing frontier angst, while historical reality offered fewer monologues and more splinters. But the myth persists because it gives the West poetic ambiance, transforming practical infrastructure into a stage for deep thoughts that, in all likelihood, no exhausted worker had the energy to entertain after 12 hours of physical labor. 25. The persistent claim that cowboys were fearless night riders patrolling the dark with unmatched vigilance pretends that nocturnal visibility, predator activity, and human exhaustion were optional inconveniences, not significant survival concerns. Yet stories portray them prowling confidently beneath moonlit skies like sentries of justice, rather than acknowledging how many dangers prefer nighttime shifts. The myth thrives because it paints cowboys as supernatural guardians immune to fatigue, fear, and the extremely reasonable desire not to stumble into a hole while half asleep. But actual workers prioritized rest whenever possible, which rarely aligns with the dramatic nighttime heroics celebrated by storytellers. 26. The assumption that cowboys loved the open range as a symbol of boundless freedom overlooks the unmistakable reality that too much freedom mostly meant long distances between water, supplies, and anything resembling comfort. But fiction reframes endless miles of harsh terrain into an inspiring personal metaphor, ignoring the practical frustration of traveling through landscapes that offered both too much emptiness and too many ways to become lost. The myth remains popular because open spaces photograph beautifully, and audiences enjoy interpreting miles of wilderness as a spiritual playground instead of an enormous logistical problem dressed in scenic lighting. 27. The belief that cowboys maintained impeccable horseshoe knowledge, treating farrier skills as a natural extension of their expertise, imagines them as walking encyclopedias of equine podiatry, when in fact shoeing a horse requires specialized training rarely provided by simply wearing a hat. Yet stories depict them hammering nails with artisan precision in moments of crisis, reinforcing the notion that every cowboy was part-time blacksmith, part-time miracle worker. The truth is that farriers existed for a reason, and the average worker knew just enough to avoid making things worse. But legends ignore such details because self-sufficient heroes sell better than realistic division of labor. 28. The notion that cowboys effortlessly mastered every tool of the frontier, from lassos to rifles to wagons to branding irons, creates the illusion of a Renaissance worker whose competence spanned 6 industries and 3 disciplines, when daily routines relied on specialization, repetition, and a great deal of trial by error. But popular narratives prefer portraying them as universally skilled frontier polymaths, rather than acknowledging that no one, past or present, can be proficient in everything without occasionally setting something on fire, often unintentionally. Yet audiences cling to the myth because it simplifies the messy complexity of real labor into a neat package labeled rugged individualism, ignoring how implausible that level of competence actually was. 29. The enduring belief that cowboys were the undisputed symbols of Western intelligence, strategists, tacticians, and sharp thinkers navigating chaos with calm authority, ignores the far more grounded truth that many daily decisions were made quickly, instinctively, and occasionally, with the kind of confidence that suggests overestimating one's own judgment is a universal human hobby. But folklore elevates their choices into acts of genius, turning ordinary problem-solving into legendary cleverness, even though much of the frontier survived on improvisation, borrowed wisdom, and the gentle hope that today's plan wouldn't immediately collapse. Yet myth prefers to crown cowboys as foresight-filled masterminds, preserving an image far tidier than reality could ever support. Turns out, the Wild West wasn't heroic, just dusty chaos with hats. If you've got an even dumber myth, drop it below and vote for the worst. More frontier nonsense incoming. Subscribe for survival.